Elizabeth Furler is a former senior executive in government and has been CEO of non-governmental organizations in public health, health service reform, early childhood development, education, and training. We were very pleased to be able to interview Liz on the topic of the interface between politics and evidence in the formation of policy, especially in regard to public health.
So thanks for coming in. We want to talk to you about your time as a public servant, which is known in some countries as a civil servant or a bureaucrat. So part of the role of a public servant is to help politicians make good policy by help gathering evidence. How much work goes into gathering what we don't know and uncertainties, which seems to us to be equally important, and what sort of techniques do you use for that?
Well, my first response is that as a public servant, certainly in the 90s, and I would say these days, the role of a public servant was more about garnering evidence that would support the politician's already chosen position. It wasn't so much about gathering evidence that would then help a politician, a minister, determine the policy of the day. In fact, it was made pretty clear to senior public servants when I was working for both the Commonwealth and the states, several states, that we were there not so much to provide policy advice as to help implement the policy of the day. I was just thinking also about uncertainties. You know, in the old days, when I say the old days, a few decades ago, in order to deal with risks and uncertainties, I think a lot more effort was put into evaluation and probably post-implementation reviews 12 or 18 months after a huge national initiative had been implemented. These were often very well resourced and independent and objective and pretty rigorous. I can think of a number of examples in the health area, for example, but increasingly there's been less interest in putting the millions often required into good, rigorous, robust, independent post-implementation review and evaluation in order to really come to grips at an early stage with unintended consequences or unknowns that came right out of the blue. You know, there's been an attitude of, well, we actually don't want to know about those things, so let's not even invest in a decent post-implementation review or an evaluation.
So is this motivated by a desire to stifle public debate, or not to be held accountable for measurable outcomes and goals? What's the motivation for not wanting to know these things?
Well, it's the motivation for any government is to stay in power, as far as I can see, and increasingly there's been a desire on the part of ministers, once they achieve office, to actually look at the portfolio that they've got control of and ask the question, well, how can I use the resources in this portfolio to ensure the government of the day is returned?
So if I hear you correctly, it sounds like you're saying if we put uncertainties into that description, that politicians are more concerned about the uncertainties of staying in power than they are about the uncertainties of the policy portfolio that they're seeking to manage.
I think they're very concerned about those uncertainties, but it's a question of when they come out of left field, managing them in such a way that they're quickly hidden or dissipated or explained away. No one's business is to predict them early on and then claim credit for for managing them well.
Right.
So this must create a great deal of uncertainty and unknowns for the service deliverers themselves, right? So they're kind of living from election to election.
Well, I think that is the reality of a lot of people in service delivery, who are at the coalface, in hospitals and schools, who can't understand the stupidity, the circularity, the irrationality of many of the decisions that are made at all levels of government that they have to live with. And the complexity of the funding sources and the decision-making processes that underpin the way those resources are allocated are just a mystery to most people, I think, at the coalface in service delivery, dealing with the day-to-day things that come through the door.
I'm just shifting over for the moment to back to the evidence that gets selectively gathered to support policies and so on. Some of that, presumably in areas like health, will be from experts in those domains.
Yep.
Now, it's well known that expert researchers, for example, who consult with the government and provide evidence or advice, often get frustrated by the fact that the language of research involves a lot of qualifications.
Yeah.
And hedging and saying, well, it's not entirely definite, but our best estimate of this is blah 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 blah, or the bulk of the evidence indicates that this is true, but we're not absolutely certain, and so on. And understandably, in some ways, this is not what the minister is going to want to hear. Right? They're going to want, this is true beyond a shadow of a doubt. So the researchers and consultants, I think, end up being somewhat frustrated by the fact that their hedging and qualifications kind of get set aside. Are there any ways that they can effectively deal with this, or is there a better way that they can communicate with that they can communicate truth to power, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, I've got some thoughts on that, but I would also say that ministers are very interested in those qualifications and those levels of evidence in another way, and that's because it helps them dismiss research findings and evidence very easily. I mean, the climate debate is a wonderful example of that, where decision makers, politicians who don't want to admit the certainties that we're dealing with in this area will seize upon the straight shooters in climate science and say, there you are. This stuff's not to be taken seriously because the levels of the words, I'm searching for the words, but the bars have been set so high by the scientists themselves in terms of what's acceptable, that even when a threat is imminent, it's easily dismissed by people that want to. Just going back though to your original question about what could the scientific community or the research community be doing to ensure that the information which it has at hand is more arresting, I suppose, for decision makers and politicians. I think clearly turning around and facing the general public for the primary dialogue about what our findings suggest, what the probability levels are in very clear language, what the risks are, having that conversation first and foremost with the general public in all its shapes and forms, and with the media, is critical in motivating politicians. And the more targeted the research community can be in terms of implications for particular people and particular communities, the better off we'll be as well.
So one of the things that, just to change tack, that we're interested in, that Mike's particularly brought to the fore, is the difference between being ignorant of something and ignoring something. And it sounds a bit like both of those become quite important in the policy making sense. But can you say a bit more about information deliberately being ignored? You've kind of hinted at that in what you've said.
Yes, well, I mean, anyone who's worked at senior levels in the public service can point to plenty of examples where information's been ignored, and there are of course, you'll have heard through popular debate and discussion, people point to many instances of where ministerial officers and staffers have changed their role over time and become more in number and stop information which is antithetical to the interests of the ministers or minister or the policy agenda of the day actually getting through to the minister, who can then say truthfully, well, I had no idea, I was ignorant of that. I think any senior public servant would be familiar with examples where that has happened, in some areas more than others perhaps.
So, do you view the public servant as being also very restricted in terms of how far into the future they can think? Is it pretty much stuff they have to deal with right now? They can't really afford to think in longer terms, or are there ways that can be done?
No, I think so. It's very much about the short term, and some governments from time to time have attempted to put together inside government pieces of machinery that would help them focus more on the long term. Some of those, I guess, have become outsourced, or they've sprung up outside of the government as well, in terms of policy think tanks, and some are university-based, some aren't, and are privately funded and have affiliations.
That was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.